I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Lowe's knows what makes SpringFest savings even better are member-only doorbuster deals. Right now, rewards members can save $40 on an Allen & Roth Chesler Gold faucet. Was $99, now $59. Plus, save $110 on a Cobalt 40-volt battery trimmer and blower combo kit. Was $279, now $169. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 3/24 while supplies last. Program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Canada Did What? A podcast from Post Media. Uncover the untold stories of the Canadian history you might think you remember with me, Tristan Hopper. From one prime minister's crazy camaraderie with communists to the war over metric conversion and the harrowing reality of the October crisis. Subscribe now to Canada Did What? Wherever you get your podcasts.
It seemed for a long time that we were headed towards a carbon tax election, and then, well, Justin Trudeau resigned, Donald Trump reappeared, and the Liberals decided to get rid of at least part of their carbon tax. Hello, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. The election is now underway. We're headed to the polls, and the question is, will the carbon tax still be part of the discussion? Despite all the claims that the Conservatives need to drop discussing the carbon tax, it's still very much an issue. Last week, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre standing in a steel mill in eastern Ontario saying he would scrap the entire carbon tax. Unlike Mark Carney, who just got rid of the consumer carbon tax, he would get rid of it for industrial places like steel mills.
Today I am announcing that a common sense Canada First Conservative government will repeal the entire carbon tax, including the federal backstop that requires provinces impose industrial taxes. There will be no taxes on consumers, no taxes on Canadian industries.
Poilievre wasn't the only leader talking about the carbon tax, though. Mark Carney, while visiting London in the United Kingdom, was defending his move to not only keep the industrial carbon tax, but to increase it on April 1st and beyond.
On the other hand, we have the opportunity to diversify trade. Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the European Union? Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the United Kingdom? Guess what one of the requirements will be to diversify trade to emerging Asia? Is to have a form of price on carbon.
So the carbon tax haunts us still. It will be an issue. We'll see how much of an issue in this election campaign. But to discuss all that, Franco Terrazzano, he is the National Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and he is also the author of a book that's soon to come out called Axing the Tax. Franco, thanks for the time.
Hey, Brian, happy to be on with you.
So let me ask you, are we having a carbon tax election?
Well, I think the carbon tax is still going to be a key issue during this election debate, and that's for two reasons, right? You look at the polls, and a lot of people are still very worried about the cost of living, and of course, the carbon tax makes the necessities of life more expensive. And even though Mr. Carney has taken the consumer carbon tax rate to zero, I mean, you know as well as I do, he still wants to run on this hidden carbon tax on business, which will, of course, increase prices for Canadian consumers. So, number one, the cost of living issue is still very important for ordinary Canadians, and the carbon tax is central to that debate. But number two, as you have pointed out, right, the big key issue is how to Trump-proof the Canadian economy. Well, of course, Washington does not impose carbon taxes on Americans, and what Carney is proposing to do would hammer Canadian businesses with carbon taxes. Well, that is a recipe to push Canadian businesses to cut down production here and set up shop south of the border. So as we look for ways to get Canada's economy firing on all cylinders again, I think the carbon tax, and specifically Carney's hidden industrial carbon tax on Canadian businesses, will be a central theme of the upcoming election.
It's interesting. The United States under Donald Trump is taking a look at a lot of our taxes and questioning whether they are de facto tariffs on American imports or a problem for American businesses. They're looking at the digital services tax. They're even looking at the GST and calling it a national 5% tariff on all imports. That's a bit weird because it applies to everything in the country, but they are considering whether to act on that. I wouldn't be surprised if they did take issue with Canada's carbon tax, but Carney has also suggested a carbon border adjustment. Now, there is an incredibly bland, bureaucratic phrase designed to put people to sleep and not tell you what it really is. Do you think that he'll go ahead with that policy if he gets in? And maybe you can explain to the listeners what a carbon border adjustment is.
Well, I do think he'll go ahead with it, right? Like, that was one of the key tenets of his leadership campaign when he was talking about the environment, is this carbon tax tariff. So essentially, it's just a carbon tax that's applied on the border when we're purchasing goods from other countries, right? And like, even as Trudeau said before he was leaving office, and he said correctly about tariffs, right? A tariff is a tax on your own citizens. So when U.S. President Donald Trump imposes tariffs on Canadian goods, what he's really doing is imposing taxes on American businesses, and those costs are passed on to American consumers. Well, the same is true when the Canadian government imposes tariffs or retaliatory tariffs or carbon tax tariffs, like what Carney is doing, right? That is just another carbon tax on Canadian businesses passed on to Canadian consumers that makes life more expensive. Now, Brian, let me also just segue into some of Carney's claims that he says why we need these carbon taxes here in Canada, right? He's talking about, there's some other countries that will impose carbon tax tariffs on us if we don't impose carbon taxes on Canadians. But like, that logic, that rationale doesn't pass just a second of critical thinking, right? So essentially what he is saying is that the Canadian government should hammer all Canadians with carbon taxes in the chance that some countries impose some carbon taxes on some businesses when we sell abroad. Like, none of that makes any sense. And really, that argument has gone there because they've lost the carbon tax argument on affordability. They've lost the carbon tax argument on the environment. So now they're just scrambling, looking for a new reason to try to sell Canadians on carbon taxes.
Well, I've been pointing out that Mr. Carney is unfamiliar with the truth. In multiple ways, he has lied. And I think this is one of them, because I went through, after he said that in London the other day, he said if we want to sell to the European Union, for example, we need to have a price on pollution, as he calls it. We'll get into the semantics of this discussion in a moment, but he said we had to have a price on pollution, a price on carbon. It's a carbon tax when it's bad and he's cutting it, and it's a price on pollution when he's good and supporting it. But if we didn't have it, we couldn't sell to the EU. So I looked at who the biggest sellers of oil and gas are into the European Union. And, well, only two of them have carbon taxes, Norway and the United Kingdom. The U.S. doesn't have a carbon tax. Neither does Russia. Neither does Kazakhstan, Algeria, Nigeria, Libya. None of them do. And they sell just fine into the European Union.
Well, and just to expand on that too, right? While I was writing this book, I went through the World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard, which is essentially just wonky to say they keep track of all the different carbon taxes around the world. And, interestingly, it's about 70% of countries around the world that do not impose national carbon taxes. So you mentioned some of them, but also some of the largest emitters in the world, really 4 of the top 5 largest emitters, are not imposing national carbon taxes, right? So Russia, no national carbon tax. And the same is the case with India, Brazil, and of course the United States. And, as we talk about these looming tariff threats, tariff war, the stuff that's already in place, we also have to remember that, yes, it's important to diversify our trade with other countries. Yes, it's important to open up trade within Canada, but it's still also important to trade with the United States, especially moving forward, and also to compete with the United States moving forward, right? And here's the key point of this whole discussion is that the United States, regardless of who is occupying the White House, is not imposing carbon taxes on Americans, right? You had Obama. No carbon tax. You had Biden, no carbon tax. When Hillary Clinton or Harris ran for office of the White House, no carbon tax. Trump, of course, never imposed a carbon tax on Americans, and I think it's fair to say he never will. So on the one hand, we're hurting ourselves, and on the other hand, we're actually helping the United States to attract businesses from Canada with all these carbon taxes.
I remember when Stephen Harper had promised to put in a carbon tax or a variation thereof, it was to match the Americans because he very astutely, a smart guy, believed that if we're going to be competitive with the United States, our regulations should match as often as possible. And that was the only time he promised a carbon tax. Pierre Poilievre made his announcement on axing the carbon tax at Ivaco, which is a steel-producing place just outside of Ottawa. He and Mark Carney have both visited steel plants recently. Carney went to Dofasco in Hamilton, and as I said, Poilievre at Ivaco. Ivaco's had layoffs already. 150 layoff notices given. Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Layoff notices given. I'm not sure about Estevas in Regina or Atlas in Edmonton, but you talk about the tariffs plus the carbon tax, which will go up on industrial emitters April 1st, correct?
Yeah, no, I look, my understanding...
But am I correct on that? It still goes up?
Yes, that is my understanding.
So if you add Trump's tariffs and Carney's increased carbon tax, all you're doing is asking for companies like ArcelorMittal, which owns Dofasco in Hamilton, to move production to one of their many other plants. They could just go down the 401, go across the Ambassador Bridge, and start moving production to Detroit or down into Ohio or elsewhere. We're going to be chasing away our own industry, and I just don't get it that people want to rally around this idea and be fine with our government effectively imposing a tariff on our goods while objecting to the Americans doing it. They have the same bad outcome.
Oh, they totally do, right? And the same outcome is higher prices, less production in Canada, and of course, fewer Canadian jobs. And this is really why the industrial carbon tax is the worst of all worlds, okay? So what Carney is proposing, he wants to hide this carbon tax, and he hopes Canadians won't notice when the price of everything goes up. But the problem for Carney is that he's trying to frame this as, look, it's only going to be the large emitters that pay for this. But nobody believes Carney. Brian, we released a Leger poll not too long ago that showed that 70% of Canadians understand that if you hit businesses with carbon taxes, that's going to mean higher prices. Only 12% of Canadians believe Carney that businesses are going to pay most of the costs of his industrial carbon tax. And it's not just higher prices, as you point out, because at the end of the day, businesses only have really three options, right? They're not going to just eat the cost of these higher taxes, higher regulations. Their three options are to pass along the cost to consumers through higher prices, or reduce their production here in Canada, which of course means less jobs, less economic growth, less ability to withstand Trump's tariffs. Or there's the third option, which is the worst option because it's a combination of both, which is both higher prices for Canadians and then also less production here in Canada.
Which means fewer jobs for everyday people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So how much, look, I know the election campaign has just started, but how much do you think this will play in? Will people be able to tie the carbon tax? A lot of them will think it's just gone, even though, as we've been discussing, it's not. Many people will think it's gone and not tie together the idea that we're hurting ourselves while we're trying to protect ourselves against the economic impact of Donald J. Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The honest answer is I don't know. Right? We still see polls that show a top concern for Canadians is the cost of living. Now, how much of that is you go to the gas station, prices are still high, or they have been over the number of years. Home heating bills have been very painful for Canadians over the last number of winters. And of course, grocery costs are still very high. So how much of that concern will be towards the government's own policies that have made life more expensive versus how much of that will be towards anger at Trump and his tariffs? It's hard to say. And a lot of it depends on the election campaign of the different parties. But I think what should be a focus of the election is not just how to deal with Trump, the diplomatic nature versus retaliatory tariffs, but I think one of the key focuses of the election is how to actually tariff-proof Canada's economy. Right? Because we've been talking about carbon taxes this whole time, but what we also have to remember is that the carbon tax was layered on top of another carbon tax and fuel regulations, which was layered on top of an oil and gas cap, which was layered on top of EV mandates and all these other different regulations that have strangled Canada's economy, which led to $670 billion in natural resource projects being stalled or suspended since 2015. So not only are we facing these energy taxes, these energy regulations, but we're also falling behind on major tax competitiveness. Every year, there's this report that ranks all of the OECD countries, right, our industrialized peers. And in the latest report, Canada ranked 31st out of 38 on income tax competitiveness. So 30 countries more competitive than Canada. Canada ranked 26th on business.
Is that individual or business income taxes?
So 31st on individual income taxes.
Wow.
26th on business taxes. Okay, and on both measures, we ranked behind the United States. So what I would love to see, and what I think I would love to see all parties focus on this. Who knows if they will? But it's not just about carbon taxes. It's not just about energy regulations and getting stuff built, but it's also about fundamentally making Canada's tax system more competitive because we're lagging behind many of our industrialized peers, including the United States.
There's this myth out there that, well, we're Canada. We've always had high taxes, and we believe in high taxes, and it helps build the social safety net. On the business tax side, going back to at least Laurier, maybe even before, part of the industrial policy of Canada was lower taxes on business than the United States so that we can attract investment. If we don't have that, we won't be able to attract investment. Over the last decade, the Liberals have kind of lost sight of that idea. They've added on extra taxes like, there's a bank tax that's just extra because you're a bank. We'll tax you, I forget, is it a quarter or 3/4 point more or something like that? You've got taxes for surcharges for high income earners. They have really decided to try and punish success. And, I think everybody believes if you're better off, you should be paying more and paying your fair share. I just think that the Trudeau Liberals, and I don't see it changing under Mark Carney, believe that your fair share is as much as they can take from you before you get up and leave.
Well, that's exactly right? I mean, under the Trudeau government, especially near the end of it, right, they were just trying to squeeze as much money from Canadians and Canadian entrepreneurs as they can get away with. Right. And I think nothing exemplifies that point more than the capital gains tax increase that they brought in the last budget. Right now, of course, they didn't go through with it this year. But what they were trying to do is essentially squeeze as much money from entrepreneurs as they could get away with. And of course, they were trying to frame this as, we're only going after the monopoly man. But that's not correct. I mean, there's been tons of analysis done. The C.D. Howe Institute with Jack Mintz crunched the numbers, and it was showing that this capital gains tax hike was really a financial sucker punch to so many ordinary Canadians who worked their entire lives to invest in properties, to save for their retirement, or to create a business. So we've seen this all along. And to kind of go back to your point about business taxes and attracting investment, that is all very good. But we also have to remember, too, what pays for all the different social services in Canada? Well, to a large extent, it is these major natural resource projects that come into Canada or that are created in Canada that allow for good jobs to be created, that allow for economic growth, but that also provide the tax revenue to pay for things like hospitals, reducing class sizes, and stuff like that.
How were the Liberals successful in convincing the public and much of the media, I would argue, in adopting their language and their ideology? The language such as the price on pollution, the price on carbon, claiming that it's not a tax, or that 8 out of 10 will get back more than they pay in. That 8 out of 10 number was shown to be false multiple times, and yet they repeated it. Now, a lot of my colleagues in the media did the same. Same with the price on pollution. How were they successful in that? Is it just a mindset that is far too prevalent in Canada that this is the right thing to do and we should punish ourselves even when nobody else is punishing them?
Well, Brian, I'm going to actually say something that I think might surprise you. And this was one of the surprising things that I did with researching for this book, right? Axing the Tax. But look, I will say that first, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, right? Not everyone in the media is the same, but a lot of people who were going along to get along with the Liberal government's language, many people in the media, many elites within the academics of Canada, they were going along with it because they wanted to shove carbon taxes down people's throats, right? Like they supported the carbon tax. That's why they went along with it. Now, I don't think ordinary Canadians ever fully bought into the carbon tax. And here's the reason I say it. And let me just take a step back and go to the provinces, for example. So when British Columbia first brought in the first economy-wide carbon tax in 2008, the Liberal government out there never ran on it, right? They never ran on the carbon tax in the election before that. The same thing happened in Alberta when the NDP government brought in its provincial carbon tax. They never ran on a carbon tax. And in fact, the first time Albertans had the opportunity to vote on the carbon tax, they turfed the NDP and they brought in the Kenney government that repealed the carbon tax as Bill 1. And Brian, as you'll remember, right, covering Ontario politics at the time, it was the exact same story with the win, cap, and trade carbon tax, where in the election previous, she never ran on a carbon tax. Now, let's go back to Ottawa and the Liberal government. Let's go back to 2015, because today it's easy to think of the carbon tax, rightfully, as Trudeau's signature tax policy, right? It's easy to think of that. But if you go back to 2015, what do you remember about that election? Well, other than the promise of legalizing weed, if you think about taxes from the 2015 election, Trudeau really ran on lowering taxes for middle-class workers and people working hard to join the middle class. In fact, you had to squint real hard back in 2015 to find any comments about a carbon tax. The Trudeau Liberals buried a vague notion of carbon pricing 39 pages down into their platform. And I actually think one of the fundamental flaws that brought the death to Trudeau's consumer carbon tax is that Trudeau never really had buy-in from the Canadian people about the carbon tax, because he was never fully honest with Canadians about just how much the carbon tax would cost. And because he was never fully honest with Canadians, never fully got buy-in, the Liberals under Trudeau were also not very honest with themselves on the actual public discontent towards the carbon tax.
We need to take a quick break, and when we come back, Franco, I want to ask you about more about the history of carbon taxes and how they came about, details that may surprise some listeners. Back in moments.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts, guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Take me out to the ball game. What are you doing? Did you know DirecTV has the most MLB games? So, you're singing? Yeah, they put your favorite teams front and center right when you turn it on. Buy me some cold cuts and flapjacks. Those aren't even the words. I'm allergic to peanuts.
Stream DirecTV, home of the most MLB games. Visit DirecTV.com. Claim based on total games offered on national and regional sports networks. RSNs available with choice package or higher. Availability of RSNs varies by zip code and package.
So, Franco, in your book, Axing the Tax, you go back into the history of carbon taxes in Canada, and not too deep. It's not a super long book. I think people will enjoy it. 120-odd pages, I believe. But Joe Clark, father of the carbon tax, what?
Well, yeah, like most people think of either Trudeau or Dion as being one of the first federal leaders to propose or bring in a tax. But an interesting little piece of political trivia here in Canada is that it was the progressive conservative government of Clark that introduced the notion of a form of carbon tax all the way back in the 1979 budget. Right now, they didn't call it a carbon tax. It was more like a fuel oil reduction tax to increase the price of gasoline. But all of the claims that they brought in their budget was essentially the claims that led to the carbon taxes of today, right? Bring in a tax to increase revenues, to conserve the environment, and to encourage people to use less oil products. Now, fortunately for us Canadians at the time, is that the government actually never was able to bring in that tax because they lost the confidence of the House of Commons shortly after that budget.
They couldn't count votes, never mind where the public was at. That's how they messed that up and ended up losing power. They miscalculated how many people were in Ottawa for the vote. You talk about the fact that, you know, we went through all of this and you go further back in the history, but then you get to 2021. And in the 2021 election, every party was running on some form of carbon pricing, market mechanisms. They would talk about it as if this is a market way to adjust the market. It's garbage. But how were we able to go from that to Pierre Poilievre effectively going across the country saying, axe the tax, people laughing at him, that'll never work, then seeing his rallies get huge and Canadian public opinion shifting?
Well, I think a lot of people, especially in Aaron O'Toole's camp, right, because he was the Conservative Party leader at the time who broke his promise to both Conservative members, also to Canadians, and even to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You'll remember when Aaron O'Toole was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, he signed this huge Canadian Taxpayers Federation pledge, and he was unequivocal, right? He put his own signature beside a pledge to promise to repeal the Trudeau carbon tax, but then also oppose every other type of carbon tax regardless of its name. And then just months before the upcoming 2021 election, he broke his promise and he ran on a carbon tax. And Brian, you know, it's crazy to say, but O'Toole's carbon tax may have been worse than Trudeau's carbon tax, right? Like Trudeau's carbon tax is a thinly veiled redistribution scheme, but, you know, at least some Canadians were getting some of their money back in actual cash, whereas Aaron O'Toole still wanted to make your life more expensive with his carbon tax, but then, like, the money would go into this, like, O'Toole savings account where you would get some credit to buy some government green goodies, like an e-powered solar blender.
I remember mocking them as Aaron Bucks.
Aaron Bucks, yeah, exactly, Brian. I remember that. It was, sadly hilarious. So O'Toole broke his promise. And not only did he break his promise, but I think he made a fundamental miscalculation, right? Because during the 2021 election, you'll see these polls that were happening. And the number one issue for people who vote for every party was the cost of living. right? Put yourself back in August and September of 2021. Well, that is when the inflation crisis was starting to take off. That's when the inflation was well above 2%, on its way to a 40-year high in 2022.
Had started creeping up in the spring and then really took off towards the end of summer.
That's absolutely correct. So the key issue facing voters, at least economically during the 2021 election, was affordability. But O'Toole handcuffed his party, handcuffed his MPs because they weren't able to wedge Trudeau on the key issue of affordability. After all, it would have been hard for O'Toole or one of the Conservative MPs running in the election to hold a press conference outside the huge gas prices when their own leader was running on a carbon tax. Now, Brian, fast forward to just after the 2021 election. And I remember all, the big time pundits, all the big brains in Ottawa who were claiming that the fight against the carbon tax is over and that the carbon tax was here to stay.
I remember people saying to me, you can't win in Canada running against a carbon tax. And I said, well, Doug Ford did, and he won.
Yep. Jason Kenney did,
and he won.
Right? And what they were missing was what was bubbling underneath the surface. And it's what Conservative MPs, when they were knocking the doors during the election, they were getting earfuls for their constituents because O'Toole betrayed Canadians' trust, flip-flopped, and broke his promise on the carbon tax. So, to many of these pundits, the elite class in Ottawa, they might be surprised that the carbon tax again became a huge political issue. But anyone who is actually talking to normal Canadians who are having struggles to afford fueling up their minivans or heating their homes or putting food on the table would understand that the carbon tax, as it is now, was still a huge issue back in the 2021 election, even though O'Toole failed to capitalize on it.
You point to a story in 2022 from CBC and specifically a poll that they commissioned through Public Square Research and Maru Blue. And people were asked how much they would be willing to pay in carbon tax. And more than half of the country said, well, about 35%, I believe, said nothing. They don't want to pay a thing. And then a smaller group, just shy of 20%, said they would be willing to pay up to $100 a year, and that's it. Now, of course, the carbon tax cost well more than that. And I think that's something that, all these polls prior to that asked, do you support a price on pollution or a carbon tax, or however they phrased it, failed to realize, yes, people want the government to do something about the environment. They just don't want to pay for it.
Well, Brian, actually, that was a poll from 2019, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was 2019, and it was commissioned just after the carbon tax took effect in 2019. And remember, in 2019, inflation was still relatively low, right? It was before the pandemic, and people even then couldn't afford a massive carbon tax increase. And what the poll showed was that even when the carbon tax was 4 cents a liter, like that poll, it was striking to me because it showed that Canadians, of course, care about the environment, but that Canadians couldn't even afford a tax of a monthly Netflix subscription. Okay? And here's the point, and it goes back to my earlier statement where Trudeau and the Liberals, they got caught up in the emotion that people care about helping the environment, but they were never honest with Canadians about what the carbon tax meant. That it was a carbon tax that would cost hundreds of dollars every single year, that would increase the necessities of life, and it would keep going up every single year. And then this poll shows that Canadians care about the environment. You're not going to get backlash because people want a healthy environment for themselves, their kids, and their grandkids. But people did not support a tax that made the necessities of life more expensive. So right there, it goes back to the point that the Trudeau Liberals were never fully honest with Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax. They never fully got buy-in from Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax, and therefore they were never fully honest with themselves about the public's appetite or displeasure with the carbon tax. And Brian, just to carry this forward a little bit more, But you'll also remember in 2019, the Trudeau Liberals misled Canadians again, right? It was just before the 2019 election that former Environment Minister Catherine McKenna told Canadians that the government had no intention of continuing to raise the carbon tax beyond 2022 and 11 cents a liter of gas. And then what happened immediately or soon after the 2019 election? Trudeau announced that he would crank the carbon tax up every single year until it reached 37 cents a liter of gas in 2030. And they never said, or they never confirmed that they would stop increasing the carbon tax even beyond that.
So would you say that the reason Pierre Poilievre was able to turn the tide is that, as you point out, there was no buy-in from the public, and he was able to read the room on affordability when Trudeau was still saying, "You'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy"?
Well, when he said that, I believe him. You know what I mean? When Trudeau said that,
sadly,
I
yes.
believe him. Yeah.
Now, we know Mark Carney thinks about monetary policy, but he also does think about carbon taxes. But is that why Poilievre was able to do it, though? Was that he was reading the room?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons why Poilievre was able to really hammer the messaging home. Number one, to your point, I think he did read the room, and I think he did a very good job of actually listening to Canadians. Now, when you're in this Ottawa bubble, Brian, as you know, right, like you can kind of get sucked in with the stream of where everyone else is going, right? And you had all the elites at the time saying the carbon tax was here to stay, there is no opposition to the carbon tax, yada, yada, yada. But I think Mr. Poilievre did a good job of actually listening to Canadians' concerns, understanding that, like, it's actually not a political winner to make the necessities of life in Canada more expensive. And then to Mr. Poilievre's credit, like he went on an absolute campaign against the carbon tax. He did a great job showing Canadians the scam that is behind the carbon tax, the fatal flaw of the carbon tax, which is this. The carbon tax makes life more expensive and it doesn't work. In fact, higher prices are a feature of the carbon tax, not a bug. So I think Poilievre did a very good job. And at least at the federal level, I have never seen another politician go to bat for Canadian taxpayers against the carbon tax like he did.
The Carney position, it will be, he's talked about shadow carbon taxes. He's talked about making big industrial polluters pay. There is no way that this does not continue to hurt the economy if the Liberals win and Mark Carney implements the kind of policies that he has been an advocate and an evangelist for the past decade. I
mean, he's written a huge book praising carbon taxes, right?
I'm in the middle of reading Values, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Now, I think a better book about the carbon tax is Axing the Tax, but I'm a little bit biased. No, you're absolutely right. And it's not only that, right? Like, Carney's trying to run on credibility, right? He's the numbers guy. He's the guy with the plan. That is what his campaign is trying to frame this around. But Carney has absolutely no credibility on one of the key questions of affordability until he's able to answer a simple question. How much is your carbon tax going to cost? Everyone knows that it's not going to cost $0. Everyone knows it's going to have a big cost to Canadians in our pocketbooks, but then also to our economy. Like, there's no way of getting around this fact, right? And, like, especially with the fact that the United States does not have a national carbon tax. The vast majority of countries around the world do not have a national carbon tax. So, like, by imposing and continuing to increase the industrial carbon tax on Canadian businesses, like, that is going to make life both more expensive and also harder to find a job here in Canada.
One of the moves that the Trudeau Liberals made at the height of anger over the carbon tax was to apply it unequally. And they would tell you that it was, no, this is a national thing. We're getting rid of the carbon tax on home heating oil for every Canadian. But we all know that the majority of people using oil to heat their homes are in Atlantic Canada, where they were starting to lose support. That really angered people in other parts of the country, in particular in Western Canada. Now, the Liberals got support back after they did that. People were like, okay, I'm fine with it in Atlantic Canada. It just made people angrier and want to vote Conservative twice in in Saskatchewan and Alberta. But so politically, it really did work for the Liberals. But how much do you think that undermined their ability to claim that this was a vital tax necessary for the health of the planet?
It completely undermined it, Brian, right? With that one move, Trudeau took the mask off. But, let me take a step back here, because the Atlantic Canada carve-out, I've heard a lot of people, especially people who support carbon taxes, that are trying to blame the demise of the carbon tax on the Atlantic Canada conundrum. But it actually starts much earlier than that, right? So when Trudeau first brought in the carbon tax across the nation in 2019, it was really a mandatory minimum carbon tax, right? So provincial governments could impose their own carbon taxes if they meet the federal standard, or the federal government would impose its own tax. But the way that Trudeau tried to sell it is that it would be a level playing field all across Canada, right? Carbon tax rates would be the same in every province, whether it was a provincial tax or the federal tax itself. But that's not how it worked out in practice. How it worked out in practice, especially in the early days, was this. The West pays more, the East pays less, right? So for quite some time, you could even find on the Nova Scotia government's own website bragging about the fact that Nova Scotia's carbon tax, cap and trade carbon tax, was significantly less than in the rest of Canada. Their carbon tax for a long time was around 1 cent or 2 cents per liter of gasoline. Now, this also created a big-time pushback, especially from premiers in Western Canada. So then Trudeau had to go back to the drawing board, right? He had to try to make it more fair, even out the patchworks. So Trudeau had three options. Number one, scrap the carbon tax. Number two, reduce the carbon tax rates in the rest of Canada. Number three, hammer Atlantic Canadians with massive carbon tax hikes. Now, Trudeau picked the dumbest possible option, and he decided overnight to increase the carbon tax on Nova Scotians by like 12 cents a liter of gas, right? So overnight, people saw gas prices skyrocket, right? Grocery costs, heating bills, all of this stuff went up. And all of that happened because of the initial political patchwork that Trudeau had put in place and allowed to flourish for a number of years. Now, this pushback from Atlantic Canadians trickled up to provincial politicians in Atlantic Canada, all the way up to the Atlantic Canada Caucus Revolt and Ken MacDonald from Newfoundland and Labrador, who stood up for his constituents and as a Liberal MP voted to repeal all carbon taxes. So then all of this happened and led to this Atlantic Canada carve-out on furnace oil. And what it did was a couple things. Number one, it proved that the carbon tax does make life more expensive, right? Otherwise, why would Trudeau announce affordability by taking the carbon tax off of a fuel source? So he showed very obviously that the carbon tax does make life more expensive, and that went against one of his big talking points. But number two, what it showed was that the carbon tax was always about politics, not the planet. Right? Because what he did was nakedly political. Atlantic Canada is a typical Liberal stronghold, and he saw the polls nosediving for the Liberals there. And so he decided to take the carbon tax off a fuel source that is predominantly only used in Atlantic Canada. Right? 97% of Canadians don't use furnace oil. They use other forms of home heating. So number one, this Atlantic Canada carve-out proved that the carbon tax makes life more expensive. Number two, it showed that the carbon tax was always about politics. But number three, it ignited regional tensions where you had essentially premiers of all political stripes, NDP, Liberals, Conservatives, all coming out against the carbon tax.
The carbon tax is with us still. Don't believe the hype, and that's why Axing the Tax by Franco Terrazzano is worth the read. The book comes out April 10th.
April 10th, yeah, and you can get your pre-order already on Amazon or check out Sutherland House Publishing.
All right, thanks so much for the time, Franco.
Hey, it was my pleasure, Brian. Thank you so much.
Full Comment is a Post Media podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Listen through apps or enabled devices. Help us out by giving us a rating, leaving us a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.